It's time to talk about a very useful service that will help you dealing with asynchronous request and also deferring the response. So you'll be driving when the promise should be either resolved, rejected, or notified. But anyways, keep in mind that what you're going to see in the next couple of lessons, especially in the ngMock, can be considered an anti-pattern, because what we're going to do is actually wrapping with $Q our $HTTP service and resolving the promise manually. But if you dig deeper into what $HTTP does, it's actually calling $Q underneath. But anyways, this doesn't mean that $Q is not a great service and should be used when you're going to concatenate promises, and I'll show you what that means later on. Let's start with the basics anyway, and this is an implementation that you'll see on Stack Overflow or in lots of different tutorials, even though it's being recently considered an anti-pattern. So first of all, let's inject our $Q service in our event factory. And the next thing we're going to do is to add a nice variable that will be deferred, var deferred equals $Q.defer. Then we're going to call our $HTTP get, and we can remove as well the events variable. We don't need that anymore. And instead of typing return data in our successful response, we will instead do something else, which is deferred dot resolve, and that's one. And our parameter for the deferred.resolve function will be our data itself. So we'll get rid as well of the data variable. We'll just put our response data inside the resolve function. Another thing we have to do, and we can do, is to add another function that will deal with an eventual error. So we'll have function error, and that's inside our then function. And the content of our function will be just deferred dot reject, and we'll give back the error just so that the app.js root can deal with that, or we can define a specific message. So instead of returning the error itself, we can maybe return also a string, like an error occurred. Please try to refresh your browser, something like that. You know, sometimes magical things happen when you refresh a browser, when in general they don't, but people still try to refresh the browser from time to time. And that's it. And the last thing we have to change is the return variable. So it will be return deferred.promise. Before we look a little bit better at what we've just done, and we are also going to format this code, let's see if our code is still working. And I can still see my list of events. So nothing has really changed. So let's see what we've just done. Well, we have declared a deferred variable which holds the $Q.defer. So with this instruction, we're saying that we're going to have a promise, but we're going to defer the response. So we are going to manually control when the resolve or the reject for the promise will be sent back to the caller in our getAllEvents function. So we have the $HTTP get call that returns a promise, then we have the then function, and inside the then function we decide if resolving our deferred promise, which is the one that the root in our app.js, our initial data function, gets. So we're returning the promise, and then we are either resolving or rejecting the promise. Why this is an anti-pattern again? Well, $HTTP is calling $Q underneath and is already returning a promise. So we could have just done what we did before, just return the event itself without any need to wrap in another promise. But let's see when the $Q service really comes handy. Well, think about what should we do when we want to do multiple HTTP requests, maybe across different sources to get the list of our events. They may be on different JSON files or on different websites. but we want to resolve all the promises in one shot and return the full list to the caller. So the first thing we can do to set up our test is to create another events JSON. I'll do that very quickly. We'll just copy the contents of the previous one into the new page and just change some of the fields. Keep in mind that after the ngmock lessons, you have a new event JSON in your initial.zip file because we're going to add IDs as well. We're going to need those to create our REST API. But at the minute, let's not bother about that. So instead of being Metallica, I'll call it in another way. Let's put a random artist, Bruno Mars, Bruno in concert, Bruno at webyrmain.com. Instead of Sherlock Holmes, we put the Avengers. We leave everything as it was, except the email. Instead of AC/DC, this time we'll have Motley Crue maybe. And that will be Motley Crue Tour. Everything else can stay the same. Motley at webyrmain.com. We can get rid of the PS10 launch event. And that's us. I'm gonna save this file and name it events2.json. Alright? So what we want to do in our event factory now is to make two different calls. So we have our $HTTP get that will call events.json and another one to call the events2. So I'll just, instead of calling that directly, I'm gonna declare a few variables actually. So we have our qdeferred, and then we have the first event, the event1, that will be $HTTP.get, basically that. Okay, that's one. And the second one will be event2 $HTTP get events2.json. Remember that the $HTTP service offers also the post function and other ones. We're going to use the post function later on when it comes to dealing with REST APIs. So when we will be creating and updating our record, it will be a post, and for retrieving it will be a get. And now we will use a marvelous service which is $q.all. And in square brackets we'll pass event1, comma, event2 dot then our user function, and we'll have our function with the result. And what we'll do inside here, well, we'll have another variable that we'll call events. That will be empty right now. We can also remove the default declaration because we're now using $q.all. And then what? Then we're gonna loop on our results because we have two different results. So it's angular.forEach result. We'll have a function as being the second parameter with our response. And inside that, we'll do events.push response.data. Okay, so we're pushing the data inside our response from each one of our HTTP calls inside our events array. So far so good, yeah? And after our loop we're just going to type return events. Okay, also let's rename this variable to something more consistent, so let's call it temp result, or maybe temp events. Okay, because now we just have an array containing two other arrays, but we want to end up having only one array of objects. And to achieve this goal, I'm gonna show you, after formatting the code actually, I'm gonna show you another nice feature of promises. And the feature is that we can chain promises, which is great because the .then function returns a promise on its own, so nothing forbids us from typing again .then at the end, declare another function that will take the temporary events as an input parameter, and then do some further elaboration inside the function. okay? And what we're going to do is to merge the data as we said. So we're gonna define a new final results array. That will be the concatenation of temp events of 0 dot concat temp events 1, okay? And we're gonna return it, of course. So return final results, okay? The last thing we have to do, actually, we need to define what we're going to return to the caller, and that's the entire q.$roll. So if I've done everything properly, I can go back to my event list, refresh, and now I'm seeing all of my events. So the $q_all service lets us wait for the entire list of promises that we are calling to be fulfilled, and based on the result we can do our elaboration and return what we need to the caller. Just be aware anyways that if even one of the promise will be rejected, the entire thing will be rejected as well. So if you have something like 10 promises and one fails, you won't get any result. This is kind of the con in using this sort of implementation. Okay? So guys, I think you have a good set of basic knowledge, and now I'll leave you for a while, but I will come back to services and we're going to talk about the dollar resource. But before doing that, Stefano, my co-instructor, which is my colleague at WebDeonMind, my co-founder, will show you how to set up an ngMock backend. So basically it will be a simulated backend functionality, and the great thing about that is that thanks to the ngMock we can code up our services like if we had a real backend on the other end. So whenever we'll have a proper backend, so think about the real world situation, you can simply get rid of ngMock, which is great for unit testing by the way, and replace it with your actual real backend. It will be quite easy. So I'll see you after the ngMock section and we'll keep going.